Grace Okonkwo stepped out of the black Mercedes as the afternoon sun beat down on the gravel driveway of her safari lodge. The long drive from Dar es Salaam airport had exhausted her, but seeing her property always renewed her spirit. The lodge stood majestically against the vast Tanzanian landscape, its wooden beams and natural stone walls blending perfectly with the surrounding savanna. She had been away for 3 weeks on a business trip to South Africa, negotiating contracts with international tour operators. It had been tiring but successful. Now she wanted nothing more than to relax in her private cabin, the one place in the world where she felt completely at peace. As Grace walked through the main entrance, her property manager, Moses, approached her with an unusual expression on his face. He looked nervous, his usual warm smile replaced by a tight, uncomfortable line. Grace felt a small flutter of unease in her chest. "Welcome back, Mrs. Okonkwo," Moses said, his voice quieter than usual. "I hope your trip was good." "It was excellent, Moses," Grace replied, setting down her bags. "The meetings went well. I made some important connections." She paused, noticing his hesitation. "What is wrong? You look worried about something." Moses shifted his weight from one foot to the other. He looked like a man who had been dreading this conversation for weeks. "Mrs. Okonkwo, there is something I must tell you. I did not want to call you in South Africa because I thought it would be better to tell you in person when you returned." Grace felt her heart begin to beat faster. "Tell me what, Moses? Just say it." "The cabin, Mrs. Okonkwo. Your private cabin. It has been sold." For a moment, Grace did not understand his words. She stood perfectly still, trying to make sense of what he had just said. "What do you mean, sold? How can my cabin be sold? I did not sell my cabin." Moses looked at the ground. 3 weeks ago, a man came with papers. He said he had permission from your husband to complete the sale. He brought lawyers. Everything was done very quickly. They removed all the furniture and decorations. The new owner took possession 5 days ago. Grace felt the world tilt beneath her feet. She sat down heavily on one of the leather chairs in the main hall. The cabin. Her cabin. The one place that belonged entirely to her, the place she had designed herself with every detail carefully chosen. The infinity pool that overlooked the endless savanna. The bedroom with the floor-to-ceiling windows. The library where she read in the mornings with coffee and the sounds of nature around her. The meditation room where she had spent countless peaceful hours. "How much?" Grace whispered. "How much did they sell it for?" $70,000, Mrs. Okonkwo. The man paid in cash. Your husband signed all the papers. $70,000. Grace knew the cabin was worth at least $500,000. More than that if you considered its location, its exclusive design, and the fact that it sat on her most valuable property. Someone had stolen her cabin for a fraction of its value, and somehow her husband had been involved. Grace rose from the chair with a calmness that surprised her. Inside she was breaking into pieces, but outwardly she remained composed. "Thank you for telling me, Moses. This is not your fault. You did what you thought was right." She walked through her lodge in a daze, past the beautiful reception area decorated with African art, past the restaurant where guests enjoyed meals overlooking the plains, past the swimming pool where visitors from around the world relaxed under the African sky. Everything looked the same, but everything had changed. She found David in his study on the second floor. He was sitting at his desk, a glass of whiskey in his hand, staring out the window at nothing. When he heard her footsteps, he tensed but did not turn around. "Hello, Grace," he said quietly. "You are home early." "The flight was on schedule," she replied, her voice steady but cold. "I just heard something very interesting from Moses. He told me that my cabin has been sold. He said it happened while I was in South Africa. He said you signed the papers." David finally turned to face her. His face was pale, his eyes shadowed with something that looked like desperation. "Grace, I can explain." "Then explain," she said, sitting in the chair across from his desk. "Explain to me how my husband could sell my property without my permission. Explain to me how a cabin worth $500,000 was sold for $70,000. Explain to me why you would do this." David took a long drink of his whiskey. His hands were shaking slightly. "I needed the money. I needed it urgently." "Urgently?" Grace's voice rose slightly. "You needed the money urgently? David, there are banks. There are loans. There are 1,000 ways to get money without selling my property. Without selling my cabin. The one place that is truly mine." "You do not understand," David said, standing up and moving to the window. He stood there with his back to her, his shoulders hunched. "There are things happening that I cannot discuss with you. Things that are complicated. Then uncomplicate them, Grace demanded. Tell me what is happening. Tell me who bought the cabin. Tell me why it was sold for so little money. But David would not answer her questions. He turned from the window with an expression of such deep sadness and fear that Grace felt something inside her break. She realized in that moment that the man she had been married to for 15 years was a stranger. Whatever was happening, whatever darkness he was involved in, he was choosing to keep it from her. I cannot tell you, David said quietly. It is better if you do not know. Grace stood up slowly. She felt as though she was moving through water, everything happening in slow motion. She looked at her husband, really looked at him, and saw the fear in his eyes, the tension in his jaw, the way his hands clenched and unclenched at his sides. You know what? She said, her voice very quiet. I do not care anymore whether you tell me or not. What I know is that you have betrayed me. You have sold something that was mine without asking me. You have lied to me. And you are still lying to me now. She walked toward the door, then paused and looked back at him. I will be sleeping in the guest house tonight. Tomorrow I am calling my lawyer. That night, as Grace lay alone in the guest house, staring at the ceiling in the darkness, she realized that her marriage was over. She did not know yet what her husband had done or why he had done it. She did not know that her life was about to become far more complicated and dangerous than she could possibly imagine. But she knew with absolute certainty that the life she had built with David was finished. The trust between them had been shattered into pieces that could never be repaired. James Mukasa was sitting behind his large mahogany desk when Grace walked into his office the following morning. The office was on the 15th floor of a modern building in Dar es Salaam, with floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out over the city and the Indian Ocean beyond. James was one of the most respected corporate lawyers in East Africa, a man who had built his reputation on being thorough, intelligent, and absolutely trustworthy. Grace had known him for 10 years and he had handled all her business contracts. She trusted him completely. Tell me everything, James said, pulling out a notepad and clicking his pen. Grace sat in the chair across from him and explained what had happened. She told him about the cabin, about the impossibly low sale price, about David's refusal to explain himself. As she spoke, she watched James's expression grow more serious with each detail. When she finished, James sat back in his chair and let out a long breath. This is very unusual, Grace. Very unusual indeed. I will need to investigate this thoroughly. Do you have the names of the lawyers who handled the sale? The company name? Any paperwork at all? Grace handed him a folder that Moses had prepared. It contained copies of the sale documents, the company name, the bank details where the money had been transferred. James opened the folder and began reading carefully, his eyes moving across each page with intense focus. This company name, he said, pointing to the document. Zenith Properties Limited. I have never heard of it before. Let me do some research. He spent the next hour making phone calls and typing on his computer while Grace sat nervously in his office, watching the city below gradually fill with more people as the morning progressed. Finally, James turned back to her and she saw that his face had changed. He looked troubled, even frightened. Grace, I need to tell you something and I want you to prepare yourself for bad news. Very bad news. Grace's stomach tightened. Tell me. I have contacted some colleagues in Nairobi and in Uganda. I have made inquiries with business registration offices. What I have found is that Zenith Properties Limited is what we call a shell company. It is registered in the Cayman Islands and has no legitimate business operations whatsoever. As far as I can determine, its only purpose is to receive money from one place and send it to another place. In other words, it appears to be used for money laundering. Grace felt the room spin slightly. Money laundering? What does that mean exactly? It means, James explained carefully, that this company is likely being used to hide illegal money. Money that comes from illegal activities. The company receives the money, makes it appear as though it came from legitimate business, and then sends it somewhere else. The people who own this company, they are almost certainly criminals. But why would they want to buy my cabin? Grace asked, her voice sounding very small. James leaned forward. Because legitimate property can be used to hide illegal money. If you buy property with dirty money but make it look like a normal real estate transaction, then the money appears clean. It is one of the most common methods used by criminals to hide where their money comes from. Grace stood up and walked to the window. She looked out at the city below, at the cars moving through the streets, at the people walking on the sidewalks, and she felt completely disconnected from all of it. So my cabin is part of a criminal operation? It appears so, James said quietly. But Grace, there is more. I did some research into your husband as well. I made some discreet inquiries through contacts I have in the financial world. Grace turned back to face him. What did you find? Your husband has significant gambling debts. Very significant. He has been gambling heavily at underground casinos in Dar es Salaam and Nairobi for the past year. The amount he owes is approximately $350,000. Grace felt as though she had been struck. $350,000? She had no idea. They had always had enough money. Her business was successful. They lived well. How could David have hidden such massive debts from her? That is not all, James continued. The people he owes this money to are connected to organized crime networks. They are dangerous people, Grace. Very dangerous. I have been making careful inquiries, and I have learned that these criminals approached your husband several months ago. They told him that either he would help them move money through legitimate channels, or they would harm him and his family. James pulled out another document. I found evidence that they forced him into an agreement. They told him to facilitate the sale of valuable property at an undervalued price. The money from the sale would go to your husband to settle his gambling debts. In exchange, the criminals would have a property to use in their money laundering operations. It was a perfect arrangement for them. Your husband gets his debts paid off. They get a piece of property to hide their illegal money. Grace sat back down heavily in the chair. She felt numb, as though her body did not belong to her anymore. So David was blackmailed? Yes, James said. He was blackmailed by very dangerous people. They threatened his life and the lives of his family. He was trapped and he made a choice. He chose to sacrifice your property to save himself from these criminals. But he could have told me, Grace whispered. He could have come to me. We could have gone to the police. We could have done something. Perhaps he was too ashamed, James suggested gently. Perhaps he was too frightened. Sometimes people make bad choices when they are afraid. They make choices they would never normally make. It does not excuse what he did, but it may explain why he did it. Grace looked at her lawyer and she felt something inside her harden. What happens now? Can I recover the cabin? That is complicated, James said, adjusting his glasses. The property has already been transferred to criminals. If we go to the police and report this, they will investigate. The cabin will likely be seized as part of a criminal investigation. We may recover it eventually, but it could take years. And there is another concern. What? Grace asked. Your business, James said carefully. If these criminals now know that you are aware of what happened, they may try to extend their influence over your lodge and your other properties. They will want to continue using your business for their money laundering operations. They may threaten you. They may try to force you to cooperate with them, just as they forced your husband. Grace felt fear grip her heart. Not fear for herself, but fear for her children, for her employees, for everything she had built. She realized that David's choice had put all of them in danger. We must go to the authorities, Grace said firmly. We must tell them everything. I will not let these criminals use my business. I will not live in fear. James nodded with respect. I thought you would say that. You are a brave woman, Grace. But you should prepare yourself. This will be difficult. The investigation will be public. Your reputation will be affected. People will ask questions. Some will believe you were involved. I do not care what people believe, Grace said, standing up. I care about doing what is right. And what is right is to stop these criminals and to expose what my husband has done. As she left James's office that afternoon, Grace did not know that her decision to go to the authorities would lead to events far more dramatic than she could ever imagine. She did not know that within weeks, federal agents would arrive at her door. But she knew that her life had changed forever, and that the darkness her husband had brought into their lives was about to be exposed to the light. Grace stood in her kitchen, watching her staff arrange the final details on the dining table. Fresh flowers from her gardens were placed at the center of each place setting. The silverware gleamed under the soft lighting. The wine glasses caught the golden light of the late afternoon sun streaming through the windows. Everything was perfect, exactly as she had planned it. It had been 2 weeks since she had visited James Macasa's office. 2 weeks since she had learned the truth about her husband, about the cabin, about the criminals who had infiltrated her life. 2 weeks since she had decided to go to the authorities and cooperate with their investigation. But tonight, she needed to remind herself and everyone else that Grace Okonkwo was still standing, that she was still strong, that her business was still thriving, that she deserved respect. She had invited 12 important people to dinner. There were 3 clients who had been considering booking her lodge for luxury tours. There were 2 business partners who had traveled from Cape Town to discuss a new sustainability project. There were several friends and local business leaders. And there was David, sitting somewhere in the lodge, probably drinking whiskey and avoiding her eyes, as he had been doing for the past 2 weeks. The dinner was meant to celebrate the new partnership Grace had arranged with a company called African Horizons. It was a sustainable tourism company that wanted to create guided eco-tours through her property. It was exactly the kind of partnership that would elevate her lodge to an even higher level of prestige. It was exactly the kind of news that would remind everyone in the business community that Grace Okonkwo was a force to be reckoned with. Her guests began arriving as the sun started its descent toward the horizon. They came dressed in elegant clothing, their faces lit with the pleasure of being invited to one of the most exclusive properties in Tanzania. Grace greeted each one warmly, shaking their hands, embracing old friends, making sure they felt welcome and valued. The dinner was held on the terrace overlooking the savannah. Long tables were arranged to take advantage of the view, and as the sun began to set, the sky filled with colors that no artist could truly capture. The food was exquisite. Her chef had prepared a menu that combined traditional Tanzanian cuisine with international flavors. There was grilled tilapia with mango sauce, tender beef with African spices, vegetables prepared with herbs from the lodge's garden, and fresh fruit desserts that made her guests smile with genuine pleasure. Grace moved between the tables like a dancer, making conversation, ensuring everyone had everything they needed. She was brilliant tonight. She was charming and witty and confident. She was everything a successful businesswoman should be. But inside she was terrified. She did not know when the FBI would come. James had told her it could be any day, any time. They were coordinating with Tanzanian authorities. They were gathering evidence. They were building their case. When they came, they would come to her lodge. They would ask questions. They would need to interview both her and David. The scandal would become public immediately. So she had decided to have this dinner first. To make this statement. To show everyone that she was not afraid, that her business was legitimate, that she was a woman of strength and integrity. Her guests were telling stories and laughing. The wine was flowing. The sunset was painting the sky in shades of orange and pink and purple. It was a perfect evening. It was a beautiful moment. It was everything she had worked for. Then she heard it. A knock at the door. Not the gentle knock of a staff member. Not the polite knock of a late arrival. But a firm, authoritative knock that seemed to echo through the entire lodge. Grace felt her heart stop beating. She excused herself from the conversation she was in and walked toward the entrance. Her staff were already moving toward the door, curious about who was arriving so late in the evening. Grace's legs felt heavy as though she was walking through water. She opened the door and saw them immediately. 3 men and 2 women, all dressed in dark suits despite the heat of the African evening. They all had an official air about them, a seriousness that made it immediately clear they were not guests. Grace Okonkwo? The tallest man asked, holding up an identification badge. I am Special Agent Robert Patterson with the Federal Bureau of Investigation. We have a warrant to investigate illegal activities that may be connected to this property. We need to speak with you and your husband immediately. For a moment, Grace could not speak. She could feel her guest's eyes on her back, watching, wondering, beginning to understand that something was very wrong. Of course, she said, her voice steadier than she felt. Please come in. The agents walked into her lodge, their serious faces looking very out of place among the elegant decorations and happy guests. Immediately the atmosphere on the terrace changed. The laughter stopped. The conversations died away. Everyone turned to look, their faces filled with curiosity and shock. One of the female agents approached David, who had stood up from his chair, his face going pale. David Okonkwo, we need to speak with you about your involvement in a money laundering operation. That was when the chaos began. One of Grace's clients stood up, his expression changing from pleasure to concern. What is happening here? Is something wrong? The other guests began whispering among themselves. Grace could see the exact moment when they began to realize that something serious was happening. She could see them beginning to wonder if she was involved in something illegal. She could see trust turning into suspicion in their eyes. Agent Patterson turned to address the room. This is an official federal investigation. We have a warrant to interview the owners of this property. We ask that you all remain calm and cooperative. This does not necessarily involve any of you, but we may need to speak with some of you as well. One of the business partners from Cape Town stood up. I think we should leave. This is not a good situation for us to be in. Within minutes, the elegant dinner party had transformed into something else entirely. Guests were gathering their things, making excuses, asking questions that Grace could not answer. Her beautiful evening, her carefully planned statement of strength and legitimacy, had become a scandal unfolding in front of her most important business contacts. David was led away by 2 agents. His face was gray. His hands were shaking. He looked like a man who had just accepted that his life was about to change forever. Grace was asked to sit with Agent Patterson in her office. She answered all his questions truthfully. She explained everything she had learned from James Mukasa. She told him about the cabin, about David's gambling debts, about the blackmail, about her decision to cooperate with the authorities. "You are not under arrest," Agent Patterson told her. "But you understand that this investigation will become public knowledge. Your business will be affected. Your reputation will be questioned." "I understand," Grace said quietly. As she watched the last of her guests leave the lodge that evening, she felt something inside her shift. The woman she had been at the beginning of the day, the woman who thought she could charm her way through this crisis, had disappeared. In her place was a woman who was beginning to understand that sometimes you cannot control what happens to you. You can only control how you respond to it. The beautiful sunset had faded into darkness. The perfect evening had turned into a nightmare. But Grace knew that she had done the right thing by coming forward. She knew that exposing the truth, even when it hurt, was the only path forward. The interrogation room was cold and gray. Grace sat at a metal table with Agent Patterson on one side and James Mukasa on the other. A recording device sat in the center of the table, capturing every word she spoke. She had been here for 4 hours, answering the same questions again and again, providing the same answers with complete honesty and clarity. "Let me make sure I understand this correctly," Agent Patterson said, reviewing his notes. "You knew nothing about the sale of the cabin until your property manager informed you upon your return from South Africa. You had no involvement in arranging the sale. You did not know about your husband's gambling debts. And you did not know about the money laundering operation until you consulted with your lawyer. Is that correct?" "Yes," Grace said for perhaps the 20th time. "That is exactly correct. I knew nothing until Moses told me about the sale." Agent Patterson nodded. James reached over and squeezed Grace's hand briefly under the table. They both knew what this questioning meant. They were establishing that Grace was a victim, not a criminal. They were building a case that would protect her from prosecution. "Your cooperation has been invaluable," Agent Patterson said, closing his folder. "Based on everything you have told us and based on the evidence we have gathered, it is clear that you are a victim of your husband's criminal activity. You are not a suspect in this investigation. You are a witness and a victim." Grace felt relief wash through her body like cool water on a hot day. She had been terrified that somehow she would be implicated, that somehow her innocence would be questioned. But now, finally, she was being officially cleared. "What happens now?" she asked. "Now we arrest your husband," Agent Patterson said. "We have enough evidence to charge him with fraud, money laundering, and conspiracy. He will face significant prison time. As for the criminals he was working with, we are building cases against them as well. The cabin will be seized as part of the investigation into the money laundering operation." Grace nodded slowly. She felt sad about David even after everything he had done. He was still her husband, still the father of her children, still someone she had once loved deeply. But she knew that he had made choices that had consequences. He had broken the law. He had put her and their children in danger. The news of David's arrest became public within hours. By the next morning, it was the main story in every Tanzanian newspaper. The headlines screamed across the front pages: "Safari Lodge owner's husband arrested in money laundering scandal. Luxury property used in international crime operation. FBI raids Serengeti Lodge." And that was when Grace's troubles truly began. Within 2 days, 3 of her scheduled tours had been cancelled. The clients sent polite emails, claiming that circumstances had changed, that they would reschedule for another time. But Grace knew the truth. They did not want to be associated with scandal. They did not want their names connected to a property that had been involved in criminal activity. By the end of the first week, 6 more bookings had been cancelled. Then 10 more. The phone stopped ringing. The emails stopped coming. It was as though her lodge had become invisible or worse, tainted. Grace called a meeting with her staff. She stood in front of them in the main reception area, trying to project confidence even though she felt her world collapsing around her. "There will be changes," she told them. "Business will be slow for some time. I will do everything I can to keep everyone employed, but I may need to reduce hours for some of you. I want to be honest with you about what is happening." She explained the situation as clearly as she could. She told them about David, about the cabin, about her cooperation with the authorities. She told them that she was a victim, that she had done nothing wrong, that she was fighting to save her business. Her employees listened respectfully. Most of them had worked for her for years. They knew her character. They knew she was a good person who had been betrayed. But she could see the worry in their eyes. They were concerned about their jobs. They were concerned about their futures. Business partners began to distance themselves. The company from Cape Town that had been so excited about the sustainability project sent a carefully worded email explaining that they could no longer proceed with the partnership. They did not want to be associated with her lodge during such a sensitive time. Local business leaders who had once invited her to their social events stopped calling. When she ran into them in the streets of Dar es Salaam, they were polite but cold. They smiled but did not invite her for lunch. They shook her hand but did not meet her eyes. Grace's lawyer, James Mukasa, helped her navigate the legal consequences. The investigation into her lodge was thorough but ultimately cleared her of any wrongdoing. The official report stated clearly that Grace Okonkwo had been a victim of her husband's illegal activities and had cooperated fully with authorities. But the legal clearing did not protect her reputation. 3 months after David's arrest, the headlines changed. The newspapers began printing stories about David's trial. He stood in court, thin and broken, as prosecutors presented evidence of his crimes. They showed how he had accumulated massive gambling debts. They showed how he had been blackmailed by criminals. They showed how he had agreed to facilitate the money laundering operation in exchange for having his debts paid off. David pleaded guilty. He did not try to claim innocence. He did not try to blame anyone else. He simply accepted responsibility for what he had done. The judge sentenced him to 8 years in prison. Grace sat in the back of the courtroom watching her husband being led away in handcuffs. She felt nothing but sadness and a strange sense of release. The man she had married was gone. In his place was a criminal who had destroyed their marriage and damaged her life's work. That evening, Grace sat alone in her office overlooking the empty lodge. The sunset was beautiful as it always was, but she could not enjoy it. She thought about all the guests who would never come now. She thought about all the money she was losing every day. She thought about her employees, wondering how much longer she could keep paying their salaries. She thought about her children, who were now the children of a man in prison. She thought about the shame they would face at school, the questions they would be asked, the way their classmates might treat them differently. But as she sat there in the gathering darkness, something shifted inside her. She realized that she had a choice. She could let this destroy her, or she could fight to rebuild. She could give up on her lodge, or she could work harder than she had ever worked before to save it. She picked up her phone and called James Mukasa. "I need to do something," she told him. "I need to clear my name completely. I need to make people understand that I am a victim, not a criminal. I need to rebuild my reputation." "What are you thinking?" James asked. "I am thinking that I should be honest about what happened," Grace said. "I should tell my story. I should let people know exactly what occurred. I should show them that I am standing strong, that I am not ashamed of who I am, and that I did the right thing by cooperating with the authorities." It was a bold decision. It was a risky decision. But it was a decision that would change everything. Grace stood in the conference room of a major television studio in Dar es Salaam, her hands trembling slightly as she held the script for the interview. It was 6 months after David's conviction, and she had made the decision to tell her story publicly. Not in whispers, not in shame, but boldly and truthfully, to anyone who would listen. "You are sure about this?" the interviewer, a respected journalist named Amelia, asked her gently. "Once this airs, your private life will be completely exposed. Everyone will know everything." "I am sure," Grace said, her voice stronger than she felt. "People need to know what happened. They need to understand that I am not a criminal. And more importantly, other women need to know that if they find themselves in a similar situation, they can fight back. They can survive this." The interview aired on a Friday evening. Grace sat in her lodge, in her office, watching herself on the screen as she told her story to Amelia. She talked about how she had built her business from nothing. She talked about how much she had loved her husband and how much his betrayal had hurt. She talked about discovering the truth, about going to her lawyer, about cooperating with the authorities despite the fear and shame. She talked about how the scandal had nearly destroyed her business and her reputation. She talked about the canceled bookings, the distancing business partners, the whispers and suspicion. But she also talked about her determination to rebuild, to reclaim her name, to prove that she was a woman of integrity. By Monday morning, everything had changed. Messages began pouring in from women across East Africa. They sent emails. They called her lodge. They came in person to share their own stories of betrayal, of criminal activity hidden by the men they had loved, of fighting to survive and rebuild their lives. Grace became a symbol of female strength and resilience. Women looked at her and saw themselves. They saw hope. More importantly, business began to return. A travel company that specialized in luxury tours contacted her about bringing clients to the lodge. A hotel chain approached her about a partnership. A magazine wanted to feature her story and her lodge in a special issue about inspiring African businesswomen. The tide had turned. But the most important development came 8 months after the television interview, when James Mukasa called her with news that made her heart leap. "The criminal organization has been completely dismantled," he told her. "The FBI and Interpol have arrested 32 people connected to the money laundering operation. They have seized assets worth over $50 million. And Grace, they have seized your cabin." For a moment, Grace did not understand. "They took my cabin?" No, James said quickly. "I explained that poorly. They seized the cabin from the criminals who had illegally purchased it. Because you are the legitimate owner and a victim of this crime, you have the right to recover it. All the paperwork has been completed. The cabin is yours again." Grace felt tears streaming down her face. She walked to the window and looked out at the savannah, at the endless golden grass and the distant acacia trees. Somewhere out there, beyond her view but on her property, was her cabin. Her sanctuary. The place that had been stolen from her was being returned. "How long?" she whispered. "We can transfer the documents and ownership papers tomorrow," James said. "You can take possession immediately. Grace, you have won." The next morning, Grace walked through her lodge and onto the path that led to the cabin. She had not been there since the day she learned it had been sold. She had not allowed herself to go there, could not bear to see her sanctuary in the hands of criminals. But now she walked slowly, deliberately, her heart beating faster with each step. The path was the same as she remembered it. The trees were the same. But everything felt different. Everything felt new. When she reached the cabin, she stopped and simply stared. It was still beautiful, still perfectly designed, still exactly as she had left it so many months ago. The exterior had been maintained. The gardens were still flourishing. It was as though the cabin had been waiting for her to come home. She walked inside and felt overwhelmed with emotion. Everything was there. The furniture she had chosen. The books she had collected. The art she had purchased from local artists. The kitchen where she had made coffee on quiet mornings. The bedroom with the windows that overlooked the savannah. The meditation room where she had found peace so many times. Grace sat on the floor in the middle of the main room and cried. She cried for the woman she had been when she first built this place, full of dreams and optimism. She cried for the pain and betrayal she had experienced. She cried for her lost marriage and her shattered trust. And she cried with gratitude that she had survived, that she had fought back, that she had won. Over the following months, Grace began a transformation of her entire business. She created new programs focused on ethical tourism and sustainable business practices. She started offering workshops and seminars to other East African business owners about protecting themselves from fraud and money laundering. She became a consultant for companies wanting to ensure their operations were completely legal and transparent. She hired a new management team, people she could trust completely. She implemented strict financial controls and reporting procedures. She made her lodge an example of how a luxury business could operate with absolute integrity and transparency. Word of her transformation spread throughout the business community. Instead of being known as the woman whose husband had committed crimes, she became known as the woman who had survived scandal and emerged stronger. She became a model of resilience and ethical business practice. 1 year after recovering her cabin, Grace stood on its veranda at sunset. The sky was painted in shades of orange, pink, and purple. The savannah stretched out before her, endless and beautiful and peaceful. She held a glass of wine in her hand and simply stood there, breathing in the African air, feeling the warmth of the fading sun on her skin. Her children were inside the cabin, playing and laughing. They had slowly begun to heal from the shame and hurt of their father's crimes. They were learning that mistakes do not define a person, that family can be broken and rebuilt, that strength comes from getting back up after you have fallen. Grace thought about everything she had lost and everything she had gained. She had lost her marriage, her trust in the man she had loved, her reputation as she once knew it. But she had gained something far more valuable. She had gained herself. She had gained the knowledge that she was strong enough to survive anything. She had gained the respect of people who mattered. She had gained the satisfaction of knowing she had done the right thing, even when it was hard. Her business was thriving again. Her lodge was once again welcoming guests from around the world. Her name was no longer synonymous with scandal, but with strength and integrity. She had reclaimed not just her cabin but her life, her purpose, and her power. As the sun disappeared below the horizon and darkness began to fall, Grace smiled. She raised her glass to the sky, to the universe, to whatever force had guided her through this darkness and brought her to this moment of peace and triumph. She had come home. Not just to her cabin but to herself. And she knew that no matter what the future held, she would be ready for it. She would face it with the strength of a woman who had already survived the worst and emerged victorious.